Classic Disney films, if you think of them as, strictly for the kiddies, you're missing almost everything. Most of them are suitable for kids. There's no question about that.
Hey everybody, welcome back to
Not So Small World
with Sam,
and Joe.
and we go through each Disney movie and kind of look at the making of it and reconsider the art of them and just look at every piece of it and kind of see what comes up and what we appreciate. And as you can probably tell, we're doing our episode about Pinocchio this time. Nobody is alive from the making of Pinocchio. It was released in 1940. So, as you saw in our little intro clip, we talked to J.B. Kaufman.
I've always just said Kaufman.
Who is a Disney historian, which, I don't know, I think that's a really cool job title.
I agree.
I've been called a lot worse. No, I generally think of myself as a film historian.
And he actually wrote a whole book about Pinocchio that was really helpful in our research for this episode. So if you want to go to this time code right here, you can watch our interview with JB. But for now, we should probably go to us before we rewatched the movie to kind of give our previous impressions. Sam did that whistle because she's a much better whistler than I am.
Yeah.
What are we watching today?
Pinocchio.
So you pretty much, from my understanding, have no recollection of Pinocchio, right?
Mm-mm.
Do you remember? You've seen it though, at least once?
Yeah, but I don't really remember any of the songs or anything about the plot or anything.
I remember the songs, but it's been a long time. It was one of these movies that we watched a lot when we were little, but I haven't watched since. So I just have like a lot of vague memories of the scene. So I'm really looking forward to seeing this one again.
I know his nose grows.
Yeah, that does happen. All right, let's go watch it.
Let's do it.
So what did you think upon rewatching it?
Strangely enough, probably the same opinion as before.
Even though you didn't really remember it that much.
Yeah, so before I didn't remember all that much of it, but now I have just watched it and I feel very neutral towards it.
Okay.
Or I guess not neutral, indifferent. It's just not my cup of tea.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't my favorite Disney movie.
Right.
But like what I do appreciate is all the technological advancements that were brought forward because of this movie.
Yeah.
And so I do appreciate that, even though like it's not a movie I would watch over and over again. But I mean, I really admire the techniques that were developed when this was created.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to name a few of them, there was the sort of airbrush look, right, for kind of creating some of the sparkles and
yeah.
And did they do something with the cheeks and stuff too to make them?
I think that was similar to what they did in Snow White.
Right, but I think they did it to another level. Like they were doing it for a lot more characters and making the faces look more three-dimensional.
Oh yeah, I think they perfected the technique since Snow White.
And of course they did a lot with the multiplane. And if you watched our Snow White related episode, remember the multiplane is when you shoot from above and you have all these different levels of art that you can manipulate and make it look like the camera's moving. But like they did some cool stuff with Snow White, but like they took it to a whole nother level with these big sweeping city shots. And including a scene that was so big they couldn't even do it on their vertical machine like they had to. It's that scene where they're first coming down as Pinocchio is about to go off to school. And it was so big, they had to load it onto a giant truck, and it's a big horizontal thing, and they had to physically move the camera forward. It was crazy.
Yeah.
But maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. My impression of the movie, I really, really love it, actually. Rewatching Snow White, it was something where it was kind of fascinating just as kind of like a moment in animation history, and that was, I think, a really rewarding part. But I feel like I was so much more like excited and engaged with the story in Pinocchio, and I think they even knew that going into it. It just felt like after they got that first one out and it was so financially successful, it's like it must have felt like it was on top of the world. You know, you could do anything at this point. You have all this money now. You have people who believe in you. You did it once. Maybe you can do it again. And it just felt like I can see that in the movie. Like there's just this rush of excitement to say like, what can we do? Like how can we pull every string that we can possibly pull every string? Okay, I didn't mean to do that, but how can we pull it? How can we pull every string and make this thing just like way beyond what we could ever have done with Snow White? And I think you see that in every aspect of it. This is probably the first time we've had a wildly different opinion, I would say, on one of the movies, right?
I mean, I think you make a great point where it's definitely, the story is definitely more engaging than Snow White.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I appreciate Snow White and Pinocchio for their place in history, you know. But I will never turn down a chance to watch them. But yeah, like there's a select few movies that I watch over and over and over again, and unfortunately they're not one of those. But I still appreciate them for what they are.
So Pinocchio himself, in the original story, the Italian children's story, which was kind of like a weird dark satire kind of thing, it was very much like this crazy little puppet come to life will just do anything and just like go out there and cause havoc and mischief and be a brat. Yeah. And so when they originally started making the story, Pinocchio in this version was also kind of a brat. And this movie had a couple different iterations. I mean, it was originally going to come out even after Bambi, but then Bambi was they needed to slow down and work on some of the production. So they actually like put it on hold, and they basically redid the whole thing with Pinocchio, which is crazy because they had already gotten pretty far on it. But one of the big changes they made is Pinocchio became much more sweet, innocent. I guess he's kind of innocent when he was bratty too, but just maybe not in a good way.
Yeah.
Like he's like innocent in a very like charming way.
And children are very cruel kind of way.
Right. And I don't know. Like I think that was probably the right move. I mean, we haven't read the original book, so maybe it worked in that context, but for the context of the story they were trying to tell, do you like Pinocchio as a main character?
Yeah, he's fine.
He's fine.
I feel like that's my catchphrase.
Just for the whole movie.
For things I'm just like indifferent to. Like, it's fine. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the decisions they made for the character, because if he was like a brat just like hurting everyone like he was in the story.
Yeah, like in the original storybook, he literally kills the cricket.
I was just gonna say that, yeah, like he literally just like right away the cricket comes into play and he kills it.
Yeah. Another character that went through a big evolution was Geppetto, who was also kind of like crotchety and a little bit stingy. He kind of looked like almost like Doc.
Yeah, in the original concept art, he looked a lot like Doc, except taller and not a dwarf.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess he looks a little bit more human-like, but kind of like what we were saying before with Snow White and how much they were trying to work on human characters. I think Geppetto is like a really good mix of like kind of realistic but kind of cartoony. Like again, I think they really were nailing a lot of that by this point in a way that like looks still kind of awkward in Snow White sometimes.
Yeah.
But Geppetto into this, I think. He does have like a lot of strange reactions in this movie. I feel like his emotions are changing quite a bit. One minute he's like, another moment he's like, oh, and then it's just like, I wonder if that is partially because he evolved so much. Like, wonder if like his reactions in certain scenes kind of carry over from old versions of the story. I don't know.
I could see that.
There were little aspects that would have been interesting to see, even down to the moment where Pinocchio goes off to school.
Yeah, when Pinocchio left for school, he said, "Goodbye, father." And Geppetto was kind of taken aback by that, and he said, "Goodbye, son."
Yeah, he gets like kind of choked up for a second.
Yeah. And I really would have loved to see that like stay in the movie. Because in the beginning you have Geppetto wishing for a son.
Yeah, like that's his big I wish moment.
Yeah.
Literally,
that's his one. Yeah. And then we never hear about that one again. We never hear like, oh, like I have a son now. I just think it would have felt more resolved if we had that little scene. Like, and that's all it would have taken. It's like 2 lines.
Yeah. I think it was something where they just didn't want to be overly sentimental and stuff. I get it, but...
See, I like the sentimental stuff, so I kind of wish they had that in there.
Right,
yeah.
I can see that.
Mm-hmm.
What's our favorite character? Because I think we can both agree.
I mean, I really love the cat, Figaro.
Right.
But I'm not sure.
Actually, every cat that's in this movie is great. Whether it's Figaro, Honest John, and Gideon. Or he's a fox.
Honest
right?
John is not a cat.
No, he's
a fox.
Yeah, he's a fox. But Gideon's definitely a cat. Wait, aren't foxes technically more related? Or no? Are foxes more related
I
to
think
dogs
they're.
or cats?
I think they're more related to dogs.
Okay.
They're canines.
Okay.
I believe so. Hey Google, are foxes canine?
All 34 species in the Canidae family, which includes domestic dogs, wolves, coyotes, foxes.
Yeah, you were right. Figaro wasn't really a character I remember like noticing that much when I was little, but like the animation on Figaro is so cute and so funny, and just like he steals every scene that he's in, I think. I believe it was Eric Larson who did most of the animation for Figaro, and he said that he really observed, I think he had like a nephew or a little son or something like that who was pretty young at the age. And I think you can see that like Figaro kind of acts like a little
toddler,
little grumpy toddler.
Yeah.
But speaking of Honest John, Honest John is definitely my second favorite character. He might even be my favorite because I love that old like washed up vaudevillian sort of flair that he has. Like he has to like just make everything sound a little bit more lustrous than it is, you know, or like. But that's why he's so good at tricking Pinocchio, because he sounds authoritative in some way, even though he's just BSing pretty much. And what do you think about Gideon, the sidekick to Honest John?
I like Gideon because I think he's basically the Dopey of Pinocchio.
Right.
In fact, he has the super long sleeves that are just like bags over his hands.
Right.
And then he's got the little like tongue going like.
Right, like all the slapstick stuff.
Yeah, it's very slapstick.
But
and he doesn't speak.
Yeah. But that wasn't how it originally was, as we found out.
No, but I think that's what he reminds me of Dopey because he doesn't speak and he's stupid.
he's a more vicious Dopey.
He's a very vicious Dopey. Dopey's the wholesome brother of the two.
Yes. I feel like I should have known this, but I don't remember learning this at all until we did the research. But Mel Blanc, the very famous voice actor, did the voice of Gideon at first when he had lines. And Mel Blanc, who was responsible for pretty much all the most famous Looney Tunes characters, like it's so interesting because I would never think of like them working with Disney, especially not back in that day when they were doing such wildly different things. His hiccups that are still in the movie are still Mel Blanc. And he had to, like, it wasn't even the original hiccups that he recorded. They had him come back after they already cut all his lines and do the hiccup parts, which I think is just so amusing. And of course, maybe the most famous character from the movie, Jiminy Cricket. What do you think about Jiminy? I
like Jiminy's. I think his casting is really great.
Yeah, Cliff Edwards does a great job.
I think he's very charming. I also like him a lot because of the character designer. And remind me who that is again.
Ward Kimball.
Kimball.
Yeah.
He wasn't happy with the final design of Jiminy Cricket because he thought he looked like a little green man, as compared to an actual grasshopper.
But that wasn't. I mean, he designed it more like original Grasshopper, but every time.
Yeah, he originally did.
And every time he would show it to Walt, he'd be like, "Nah, it's too ugly. No, you gotta make it cuter." And so he just kept on taking away all the insect. I mean, I thought some of those designs were pretty cute, even when it was more bug-like. But yeah, I have to read his quote verbatim. Ward Kimball. He says, "I finally got this blob, as I called it. It's not a cricket. It is a blob. It is a little man creature with no ears, and he wears little English outfits, and is only reminiscent of a cricket's. And the only reminiscence of a cricket's wings are the tails of his coat, and I still hate him." So it's probably a little tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, you can tell that wasn't like his ideal for what he wanted the character to look like, for sure.
Right.
We were kind of interested in looking at some of the deleted scenes and in storyboards and stuff from the movie, because one thing that we actually really liked that we saw was this idea that like Jiminy was also kind of tempted throughout the story. We like the idea that maybe it's not just like Pinocchio who has to go through this path. Like, you know, even the people who sometimes want to lead you on the right path can also go astray. Which I guess he does kind of walk away from his responsibility a few times, but it...
Well, also, like, what is there to convince me that Jiminy's qualified for his job as a conscience, you know? Basically, he was at the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
And the fairy's like, here you go.
Right.
You're the conscience now.
Right.
But I want to see, growth on Jiminy's part. Like, if there's temptation, I want to see him tempted, but then resist it.
Yeah.
You know?
Like, listen to his own...
Like, why should Pinocchio listen to this person, you know?
Right. But I think, at least, even though I think there are ways that could be more explicit, I do think that there are ways in which Jiminy kind of grows into that role, like, a few times.
That's
you know?
true, yeah.
Because there are a few times where he's, you know, it says...
He tries to leave.
He tries to leave, and he ends up coming back. So there is elements of that. But I it would have been interesting maybe if there was...
I think it would have been stronger maybe if he was tempted or...
Right.
You know?
Right. The setting, like, what do you think of the whole setting of the story?
I think it's beautiful. Like, the way the backgrounds are painted. There's a lot of small details, especially in the shop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And once again, Gustav Tengren, who we talked about in our Snow White episode, he did a lot of beautiful production art for this one. I think even more beautiful than some of the Snow White stuff, because maybe he got a chance to show more of like his European background with like these cobblestone streets and the houses and the way the streets are all winding and everything, and it's just very charming. But one thing that we definitely took away upon rewatching is just how dark this movie is, right?
Oh yeah, like in comparison to other Disney movies, you know?
Right. And we were just talking before about how, like, you know, people think Jiminy Cricket and, like, When You Wish Upon a Star and all this schmaltz and stuff, but, like, rewatch the movie. Like, it is, like, it's not as dark as maybe the original story was, but it's pretty grim in a way that, like, I can see some of, like, even some of the horror movie influence and stuff on scenes like the donkey transformation.
Yes.
You literally have, like, a big plot of the movie is that children are being tricked away into forced labor and transformed into donkeys and who can't talk or have any independence. Like, that's pretty dark, no matter which way you pitch it.
Another level to that darkness, that aspect of the story is what's leading the coach to Pleasure Island are donkeys.
Yeah.
And we know where those came from.
Unlike a lot of other Disney stories, none of the villains really get a comeuppance in this story. And we meet quite a few of them. There's Stromboli, there's, you know, the coach, and there's all the coachman, and there's the fox and the cat, and there's, you know, there's all these dark influences around them trying to sway away this complete innocent. And none of them ever really, although we did see a version of this story. Again, this is like a scene that was planned that didn't end up happening, where Honest John and Gideon come back a third time in the movie. And it's then, as Pinocchio's trying to go off to save Geppetto, that he meets them again, and this time he's not tricked by them. And they end up like completely flipping and just like freaking out and trying to chase him down and get him and all this stuff, which is another idea that we really liked, that I think would have been really cool to see in the movie.
Well, I think what's in a lot of fairy tales is like the power of three. You know, like you have your 3 wishes. You know, and like maybe like 3 nights or whatever. But strangely, like Pinocchio only gets tricked like 2 times by Honest John. And if you need to see them come back for a 3rd time to show that Pinocchio has learned his lesson. And then once they realize they're not gonna get their way, they start attacking him. Right.
It's like the veil is gone, and they're showing them their true selves in a way. And, you know, I mean, once again, we're quabbling about what I think is a masterpiece of animation, but you know, when you see these alternative ideas, it kind of makes you wonder, and you say, oh, that would have been really cool to incorporate that aspect into it. Although one of the funniest scenes that they cut that just seems so out of place now is when they were stuck on the whale, stuck inside the whale, and they're starving, and the goldfish is there, Cleo, and the cat, Figaro, and Geppetto start eyeing it, and like they want to eat the fish. Like they start going crazy, and they're like gonna kill this beloved sentient fish that he calls his, what does he call his water baby or something?
Yeah. I think it would take away some of the sweetness of Geppetto.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which apparently the voice actor wasn't always incredibly sweet.
No.
So Christian Rube, who did the voice of Geppetto, he had been like a long time character actor and stuff like that. Actually, he replaced another guy who originally did it, but he also stood in for all of their live action reference footage, which looks like I didn't really understand what an involved sort of process their live action stuff was. I mean, they built all kinds of big props and slopes and boxes, and like they had like a whole big like actual like movie set to film all this reference footage. It wasn't just like on a wall or whatever behind them. So they had a bit where they were trying to get reference footage for Christian Rube on the boat inside the whale. And every time Christian Rube would show up on these live action reference footage sets, like, World War II was going on at the time, and Christian Rube was not for the American side of the war. And so he kept talking about how great, they were over there in Germany and everything. The people at Disney were getting sick of him, so when they were filming this bit where he's on the boat, they just shook it as hard as they could. They were really giving this guy a ride. They said after that, we didn't hear any more about how great Germany was and everything. Maybe he would have been alt-right today. Do you want to talk about another dark moment that was cut from the movie?
Yeah. So Pinocchio ended up dying in the original story.
In a pretty gruesome way.
Yeah, not in a good way. He went to puppet heaven, where St. Peter told him, "You're not good enough." So they sent him to puppet hell, where Satan was like, "You're not bad enough."
Yeah, like that was actually, I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, I don't think that was even in the book.
And then they just sent him back to our land, to real life.
Another thing that surprised us, and I think it probably surprises a lot of people who watch the movie again, if they haven't seen it in a while, is how short the nose growing scene is.
Yeah.
And I thought I remember it happening a couple times, but it really only happens once. He lies a couple times and it gets longer and has the bird's nest on the end. Maybe it's just such a like very visual, memorable moment. Maybe it just sticks in people's heads, I
agree.
But then it's gone, and he kind of like learned that lesson about not lying. It's over in like a minute. And actually, as of this recording, it was only just a few months ago that Marjorie Belcher, who was the stand-in reference for the Blue Fairy, actually just passed away. She was the last remaining person alive who had worked on Pinocchio. But she had a really incredible career filled with all kinds of interesting work with her second husband. And although she was married to one of the Disney animators, Art Babbitt.
Oh, yeah?
For a while, yeah. And, just an incredible person. If you look her up, like her dance career and everything was just really fascinating. But Blue Fairy originally in the story was very, in the book, she kind of appeared in different forms and stuff like that. So they kind of just had to choose one thing, and that really ended up being her as a human woman and, with wings, and then later on we see either her or a representative of her as like a dove.
Yeah, and I think when I was little, I was a little confused about that part because I thought, oh, this is a messenger of the fairy. But I think it's implied that is the fairy.
Yeah, it could be either way.
Yeah, it could be either way.
It probably doesn't really matter that much. She's kind of just there to help when when things look hopeless. Pleasure Island wasn't originally called Pleasure Island.
Nope.
Again, maybe this might get us demonetized, but it was originally called.
There's an extinct bird called a booby, and that's what it was named. It was called Booby Land. And a booby also means a very stupid person.
Yes, yeah. So,
and that's what it means.
Yes. So, yeah, and originally it was not this like kind of dark hive of sin that we see in the movie. It was like Candy Mountain. It was like, I mean, it was like the inside of Wonka's factory, like the river made of chocolate, and it was like bubblegum trees and all that stuff, and it was very much like this big fantasy, which is another kind of interesting change, I think, to move away from that and have it just be like very explicit, like, no, we're luring you into the stuff you shouldn't do. One of the interesting things happening at this time in the company is kind of going through a transition. You had kind of the old guard that had been there making like all the original shorts and working on Snow White, and then you kind of had a new crop now that they could afford to bring new people in and train new people, and they were going to have this brand new studio that they were building. You had these younger people who were coming in and kind of changing the game, and one example of that was Milt Kahl. And Milt Kahl was partially or almost entirely responsible for making Pinocchio as we know him. It sounds like obvious now, like the designs feel so natural because we've seen it ever since we were little, but they had to make a puppet come to life. And how do you do that? Like, how do you make it look like a puppet but it's also alive? And like their early designs just weren't quite getting what they wanted, maybe leaning a little too hard into the puppet, or maybe leaning a little too hard into the person. So it was really Milt Kahl who kind of really impressed Walt by coming up with the design we know. And he started with the fundamental of it's a child, and you think of it as a child, but there's just little things about it, about that character design, that make you believe that it's a puppet, right?
Right.
So, like, for example, you have a flexible face that moves like a human child's, but you have a stiff nose. Like, the nose isn't, like, wrinkling up or, like, moving with the face. Or you have stiff puppety legs that have, like, the hinges, but then it moves into these flexible like shoes that actually like this, the foot moves like an actual foot, and the hands move like an actual hand, even though they're on like these wooden, it's such an amazing like accomplishment that they were able to pull off that illusion, I think, because every time you start to like bind him as a kid, he does something like spin his head around or something completely 360, and I think it's a wonderful balance that they made with that. I think one of the most amazing technical achievements of the movie is the water.
Yes.
And they had some people just working on water for this movie, and it's stunning. Like, it is amazing during the scene, especially with Monstro the whale at the end. And I'm like honestly amazed how exciting that scene still is. Like that is a great, exciting scene, and the water I think helps it. It's somewhat stylized, but what they did is they actually had layers, right? They actually cut out layers and they kind of laid them on top of each other.
Yeah.
So that kind of gave a little bit more dimension and stuff. Like even underwater, they did some cool stuff with distorted lenses.
Yes.
To kind of give it that look. And they even did some cool things with the audio. They literally just took the audio and lined it up on the projector like they would normally to take it in, and they just wobbled the film so that like you get that that underwater sort of garbled sound effect. And it's pretty cool. Like you can still tell what they're saying, but it gives that sound. Songs in this movie as opposed to Snow White, I really like how they're integrated, because with Snow White, they're integrated okay, but it kind of feels like everything kind of comes to a stop and then they sing the song, even though they might have something to do with the story, like Whistle While You Work. But with Pinocchio, I feel like they've blended much more seamlessly into the story. Like it definitely feels like, like Little Wooden Head kind of comes and then it goes after like a verse or two, and then you have like I've Got No Strings on Me, but that's an actual performance and the music's integrated into performance. I really, really like the music, and even the score is so good, it's so beautiful in this film, and uses such an amazing variety of instruments, including something I didn't know about called the Nova chord, which they used for, it was kind of like it was like an old early version of a synthesizer pretty much, and they did a lot of cool stuff with like the bell sound effects and stuff with that, like when the blue fairy enters, that's like an old synthesizer pretty much. It's really, really cool, and just a wonderful music. And it's kind of disappointing because apparently at the time there were a few people who liked the music in Snow White so much better, and they made that noted. And I think Walt kind of took that to heart. It seemed like after that he kind of like shied away from integrating the music more and kind of had like the big showstop moments. I don't know, does that sound about right, like going forward?
Yeah, I think that the company definitely went in thinking that they were invincible after Snow White.
Yeah.
But after Pinocchio didn't do so well, that was definitely a very humbling experience.
And it didn't do that well, did it?
No.
Part of the problem was, since World War II was going on, they couldn't even get the film prints out to places like Italy. That's probably what ate it up, when it first came out. They were able to get it there, I think maybe 4 or 5 years later, and it did great then, after the war was over and everything. But at the time, they mostly had to rely upon the box office, and they had rented out big theaters expecting the same kind of turnout they had for Snow White, which was just unprecedented, and just didn't hit the same way, which doesn't say anything necessarily about the quality of the movie, because it seemed like critics still really loved it and people who saw it seemed to like it overall.
I think they were expecting a princess movie, and this was not a princess movie.
Right.
And I personally see Pinocchio as very creative and witty, and I don't think that's necessarily what they're looking for. They were expecting another Snow White, and that's not what they got.
Yeah, Snow White, I mean, it has its dark moments, but it's a lot of silly sketches with the dwarves, and, it's the romance that comes in when they sing and stuff like that. And, yeah, I mean, Pinocchio's not really that. There's not really a romance. There's no, it's much darker. It's much more, like, focused on real-world problems and real-world, I mean, it's still fantasy, but it's still more grounded, I think, in reality. And maybe that just didn't appeal to people as much. I don't know. But clearly it's had a longer legacy since then. I mean, some people still consider it one of the greatest animated movies ever. I don't know where I place it on there, but I really love it, and I really respect it. Definitely more of a favorite for me than Snow White, for sure.
Yeah. And I agree with that. Even though I see them on a similar level, I agree that I enjoyed Pinocchio a lot more.
Okay, that's cool. One of the things that I found most delightful is sheet music was really, really big back then. And they actually made some songs that they included in songbooks that they said were in the movie but weren't in the movie and were just written for like this promotional stuff. And so there's an Honest John song that's kind of fun. And another Jiminy song, but there's my favorite is there's a song about which character?
Monstro.
Yeah, Monstro the whale. and it's like Monstro in the movie is just this big hulking, like intimidating presence, and this song is just so not that. It's so goofy, and it has like some pretty funny, clever lyrics and stuff. It's just very ridiculous, but I would check that out if you can find it.
And Monstro is his name. Me, Monstro.
Another very famous animation producer, Max Fleischer, who has a really wonderful style in and of himself with his company. He was working on an adaptation of Gulliver's Travels at the time. And of course, animated movies were still a pretty big new thing. It was just kind of funny to read about that because the crew at Disney weren't worried about this movie coming out before theirs because it would be like so good that everyone would forget about Pinocchio. They were worried that this movie would be so bad that it would like tarnish animation and they no one would go out to see Pinocchio. Just kind of funny, but I mean I've seen bits of it. It's okay. It's not great. It's all right. But they didn't end up having to worry because I think Pinocchio definitely has the longer legacy as opposed to Gulliver's Travels. Like, I think right from the start, even at the time, the big runaway success from the movie was When You Wish Upon a Star as a song. Why do you think that song in particular has like become the Disney song? Like, it's even in their opening logos now.
It captures the Disney aesthetic in those lyrics.
Right.
And most of the characters do want something.
Yeah.
And
as we all do.
Yes. Yeah, as we all do.
we're still uncovering all of the many ins and outs of what Disney history entails. I mean, it's about a century's worth of information and trivia, and you said that, of course, that you're interested in classic film of all kind, but what in particular about Disney films drew you to them?
Well, actually, Disney was where I started. Like a lot of people, I kind of grew up as a Disney kid. You know, I discovered movies at about the age of 5 by watching a Disney movie, and it was at this point, I think it's safe to say it really was a life-changing event. So that was my starting point. I For a long time I was just in love with movies, and then I eventually, about the age of 12, I discovered the concept of film history, and then eventually figured out that Disney was a big part of film history, and so one thing just kind of led to another.
Like, how did you initially get started at Disney? Was it like through a connection, or did you reach out to them initially?
Are you talking about actually working for the company? Because I never actually have been an employee of the Disney company.
Really?
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
talking about working for them, but that's interesting that you never were like an official employee.
Actually, this started out as a hobby, and but it was just something that I loved so much I couldn't not do it, you know. So I started out um, probably when I was about your ages, wanting to write a book about the Walt Disney short cartoons of the 1930s. And I was pretty naive back then, and I had an idea that I could just walk into the Disney archives and start working. So I approached them and said, you know, this is who I am and this is what I want to do, really thinking that I could just go in and sit down and start working. And they said, "Sit down, son," and they kind of explained the facts of life to me. And you may know that when it comes to actually getting inside the company and working at the archives, the rules are constantly in flux. The rules have been changing, you know, constantly over the years. At the time that I first approached them, the rule was that if you were writing a book, they didn't deal with authors; they dealt with publishers.
Oh.
Really?
So if you wanted to write a book, you had to have a contract in hand before you even approached them.
Wow.
But articles for periodicals were a whole different story. And so I thought, well, you know, out of all those shorts they made in the 30s, there must be a number of them that are remarkable in some way that would make for a good article. So I started focusing on those, and I thought maybe I can build this book one brick at a time, you know. So that's basically what I started doing, and as long as I was willing to follow the rules, they were very, very friendly and helpful and forthcoming. So that was kind of how I got started doing this.
Okay. What are the archives themselves like? Because from my understanding, they were one of the first major film studios to have such an extensive, like, cataloged back archive. Is that true?
I believe that is true, yeah, and that is all thanks to Dave Smith. You probably know he started the archives in I think 1970, which was only 4 years after Walt's death, and you know, I guess he basically approached them with this idea that such a thing could be done. I must say he was a bulldog. He went to every place. You know, he kind of you know that Walt's story, his actual story as a filmmaker, starts in Kansas City. Dave went to Kansas City and he scoured every possible, you know, nook and cranny to find um, items that reflected Walt's work there. And I mean, it wasn't just there; it was everywhere. He really built up an amazing collection, and he was helped by the fact that um, either Walt or somebody in the organization had a lot of foresight and actually did preserve almost everything. I do a lot of research on a whole range of film history, including silent films. And there have been any number of times when I've been trying to research a specific silent film, and you're lucky if you can just piece together enough scraps of information to try to kind of cobble together a rough history of how the film was made. At Disney, you're at the opposite end of that spectrum. They, more than any other studio, I believe, more than any other studio, they saved everything.
Like, what is that process like, as far as like deciding what goes into the book and what is left out?
So far, and I'm knocking on wood here, so far I've been really fortunate in that I've been given kind of a free rein. So, um, I feel that the historian's job is to know everything, but not put everything in the book. You want to know everything, but then you want to take all of that information and summarize, synthesize, boil it down to the essence. It's part of the historian's job to figure out the best way to present all of that information in again, a manageable and kind of coherent form. So, so in one sense, so far I haven't had any limits at all. I've been able to basically put in the whole story. It's just a matter of wordsmithing, condensing the language so that you get it all across, but you don't spend the rest of your life doing it. And one of the great things about this is that when you start following one of these trails, it always leads to others. One thing inevitably leads to another. So in writing about Snow White, I didn't feel that I would be able to really tell that story until I had explored the origins of the Snow White story, where it came from in the first place. And as a result of that, I wound up getting kind of a crash course in folklore, which is a subject that I hadn't ever really known about before. But it's a pretty fascinating subject in itself, and I felt that it was important to give that background before getting into the film. And nobody told me that I couldn't do that. So I had the freedom to include all of those facets of the story, and then it was up to me to again wordsmith it and put it in a manageable form. So so that it would be accessible to the reader.
It's really cool that they have given you the freedom to tell that kind of stuff that isn't quite as sanitized as the image they typically put out. Is that something you're conscious of? Is that something that they are like giving feedback on, or is it really just like, no, tell the story?
Well, so far, and again, I'm knocking on wood, so far, it's something that they haven't even questioned. It's part of the story. I think it's important to make a distinction, and I hope they continue to make the distinction between storybooks for the kiddies, which of course is a big part of their business now, and books like this that are actually intended for adults. Um, because to me, it's very, very, very important to keep in mind that Walt Disney was an artist. This guy was a really important major artist in the real world.
Did you have a favorite Disney alum that you liked working with, alumni?
I'm not really big on best comparisons
Mm.
Mm.
and on greatest comparisons, and more or less the same token, um, it's hard to single out favorite people. It's like uh, well, like, you folks, apart from each other, if you had to name a favorite friend, um, that might be really difficult. And
Yeah.
I feel the same way about at this point over the years I've interviewed 40 some people who worked at the Disney studio during those years. And it's hard to single out, I might be able to single out 5 or 10 favorites, but not one.
Yeah.
So like Jack Kinney. Jack Kinney was a great guy, and I did get to know him and his wife pretty well. I interviewed him a number of times And he was just a great guy, and he was a bottomless well of stories, and they tended to be pretty colorful stories. But as far as one could check them for accuracy, they tended to be pretty accurate,
Oh wow! Oh,
historically
no
accurate.
kidding.
Joe Grant was just a wonderful, wonderful guy, and I think you probably know about him.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
he was so important in story and in character design and so on, and he was just um, he was an artist to his fingertips. He and his wife both were really accomplished artists, and they loved art. But one of the times I went to see them in person, they had just come back from like a world tour, and they brought back, paintings and sculptures and all kinds of things that they had collected in some of these capitals. Just a really inspiring guy. He didn't like to talk about himself, um, and I had to pry some of those stories out of him. But he was just a really generous, really creative guy, and a real inspiration, I thought.
We also heard that people gave strong opinions about Pinocchio, and they actually like wrote into the studio, like they wrote all these letters. And we were just wondering, like, was that a common thing where people would just write letters to the studios with their opinions?
Yeah, when you talked about that part in the book, it almost felt like reading internet comments today that you
Yeah.
could see about whatever latest
Almost.
Disney film.
Yeah.
Yeah, almost. I can't really say as to movie studios at large. It is well known that the major movie stars got tons of fan mail. So I can't imagine that some movie fans didn't actually just write to the studios to comment on the films. My sense is that the Disney studio didn't have nearly as much of that with Snow White as they did with Pinocchio.
Mm.
And my sense further is that while the studio was working on Snow White, nobody knew what to expect. They had seen all these marvelous cartoons coming from the Disney studio. They knew that Walt was working on something on a feature-length animated film, and that it was going to be unlike anything they'd ever seen. But I think some people were expecting a 10-reel Mickey Mouse. It was just such a new concept that I think a lot of people were just thinking, well, let's wait and see. Let's see how this turns out. And then when they did see how it turned out, of course, the whole world fell in love with it, and it was an enormous worldwide success. So at that point, I think a lot of people felt almost proprietary about it.
Mm.
And when a new film came along, as wonderful as it wasn't Snow White.
No, it was not a princess movie.
And I think that a lot of people at that point felt, perfectly entitled to write directly to Walt and tell them what was wrong with his movie. And of course, lots of people loved it too.
Yeah.
But yeah, my sense is that criticism, and especially some of the individual criticisms, I think that was a new thing for Disney at that time. I have no doubt that they got fan mail all the time, but that particular kind of comment, I think, was more or less a new thing.
The only thing I can think of as a comparison based upon what I know about is the way people would write into Arthur Conan Doyle about the Sherlock Holmes stories. It just felt like the way in which I've heard how their fans interacted and felt so personal about Sherlock Holmes sounded so. It sounds so modern compared to what I typically picture from like the early 20th century and stuff like that.
I'm not as familiar with that, but I could picture it being the same kind of thing. If people take a creation like that to their hearts, I think, and especially, I think that especially applies to Disney, because so many of us start out in childhood, with some kind of Disney influence. I know I did. I think lots of people do. from a very early age, they're getting these kind of primal influences from Disney. So I think when they come of age, it's not uncommon for people to feel a kind of feeling of ownership, and 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 some people take it to extremes. They really, this is mine, and 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 uh, and they don't hesitate um, to dictate what other people's opinions should be too.
Yeah, I feel like there's almost a bit of pretentiousness sometimes aimed at people who are still very protective, I guess, of the way Disney holds a specialness in their lives. And I guess I can understand some of those criticisms to an extent, just because, I think, maybe sometimes people are afraid to be critical of things they love. But at the same time, I also find it so cynical the way that some people completely look down on anything Disney related, whether it be because of their feelings towards, just a major corporation, which I can understand, okay. or whether it's maybe just a sense that like, why are you interested in this children's thing? But at least I know the way I feel about it. And I'm sure the way you feel about it is I don't see them purely as children's things. And I think about the massive amount of work that passionate artists put into this massive undertaking that takes years to accomplish. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's, the classic Disney films. If you think of them, and lots of people do, but if you think of them as strictly for the kiddies, then you're missing almost everything. They are suitable for children, but the important thing is that they are works of art. The better part of a century later, the top people in the animation industry still go back to Pinocchio over and over and over for endless inspiration. The imagination in it, and even more the craftsmanship with which it was put together. It's just staggering. It still is, 80 years later.
And both of us had forgotten even just how dark it is, and I think that says something again to maybe who the audience is. And my 12-year-old sister, or 11-year-old sister, watched it for the first time since she was very little, and apparently she asked my mom. She was like, "Am I allowed to watch this?" Like she herself was questioning. Like, she's also a very sensitive kid, but I think that really speaks. We were kind of surprised because we hadn't seen it in a while ourselves. Just right, like.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised, but I think it belonged there. It was like, the story was still like wonderful, and I still really enjoyed the whole thing.
Yeah.
I was swept away by it. That didn't deter from what it was trying to tell me.
Yeah.
We had our grandson over here a few nights ago, and he watched Pinocchio for the first time.
Oh.
And he was just, I mean, he loved the whole movie, but when we got to those climactic scenes, he couldn't sit still. He was just, it was just so intense and so exciting. He really got swept up in it. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's dark, but boy, it's exciting, and it's on a storytelling level and on the technical level. It's amazing stuff. So I think that one of the really striking things about the film is the early sequences in Geppetto's workshop. They're warm, they're funny, they're appealing, and the endless artistry of those clocks and music boxes. That's just, and I don't know whether Walt was specifically thinking of it in this way, but the effect of it, I think, is that it establishes this just wonderful, warm kind of home base in your perception of the film that kind of helps carry you through all of those dark passages that come later on. And some of the dark passages are pretty amazing too. I mean, you know, you're getting a load of artistry there too, but there's something reassuring about those workshop scenes. And then when you come back to the workshop at the end, it kind of, you know, ties it all together. It is really the only film in Walt Disney's animation film career that was made with a perception of no limits whatsoever. You know, they had the constant struggle of, you know, keeping the plant running during the making of Snow White, and, you know, mortgaged everything they owned and so on. But because of the tremendous success of Snow White around the world, I think Walt really believed that there were no longer any limits at all. And so that feeling kind of permeated not only through, you know, things like building the new studio and so on, but also in the making of Pinocchio. Nothing was off limits. This wonderful medium that they had transformed, you know, by themselves, um, it could do anything. And so when you know, when the story was being developed, anything was fair game, and any story idea that they came up with for this, you know, for this film, was fair game, and they could go wherever they wanted to with it. They really had a medium that could go anywhere and depict anything. And you know, I think that excitement that they felt in you know, in tackling this story where the sky was the limit, I think that excitement became embedded in the film, and you can't watch the film without feeling some of that yourself.
What I love too is they didn't just like retrace their steps with Pinocchio. They came up with something new for Snow White, and then for Pinocchio, they created this like they innovated this like what was that that scene that like winded around?
Yeah,
Yeah.
with
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
the
like
massive.
that was brand new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's still, I mean, when you see that on the screen, it's still just breathtaking
Yeah, it really
to
is.
realize that you're looking at paint and glass. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, it's so staggering what they accomplished in that scene. Um, and that's just one of many, you know. But yeah, that is a pretty standout example.
Yeah, I even before I became extremely passionate about Disney, I think I was also extremely passionate about Pixar. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between that.
Sure.
And there's something so exciting to me still to watch like some of their early movies and shorts, because like there's something about like kind of seeing the seams of everything and seeing just the amount, like just trying to fully comprehend that the miracle of what they're trying to do, that like as beautifully complex and technically powerful their recent stuff is, it doesn't have quite the same shattering impact on me sometimes. And that's kind of how I feel watching some of these early Disney films. It's like we were talking about in our Snow White episode. Like these are people, like we're in our mid-20s, and many of these people at the time were younger than us.
Yeah.
And changing a whole industry and learning about how that came to be is just like it's just crazy. It's so jarring and extraordinary to think about that, I guess.
It is. It's an amazing thing. You know, as I told you, I've talked to I forget the exact number, but 40 some people who worked at the studio during those years. And over I've heard about people who, excuse me, were working at another studio and got an opportunity to go to Disney and willingly took a pay cut just for the prestige of being at the Disney studio where these wonderful things were happening. Um, you know, I mean, it's just, you know, I talked to people who loved him and some people who hated him, but um, but the common thing among all of them was that they admired what he had done for the art of animation.
I was gonna ask, like, why do you think the film is as coherent and cohesive as it is, given how many different directors there were for different segments and stuff? But I'm wondering, do you think it might have something to do with the fact that everyone was just like, I'm giving 1,000% to this? It just, that energy of...
And documenting everything, too.
Yeah.
I think that is, of course, one of the big factors behind, what a great film it is. But your point is well taken, that not only because of the number of directors, but also because of the tremendous amount of adaptation and reshuffling that took place during the story process. It is remarkable that it comes out as such a cohesive film. That is one of the wonders of Pinocchio. Ideas would be hatched and really pursued for months on end, and then abandoned because a better idea came along. And when I was working on the book, I made a chart just for my own reference, kind of a timeline charting when each of these sequences was started, and then which ones were adapted and kind of molded into other sequences. And at the end, when it all finally came down, some of those sequence numbers didn't change even as the sequences were moved around. So if you go through the whole film, if you chart through the whole film and follow the sequence numbers and try to make sense of how they all fit together, you'll wind up talking to yourself, because it's just like a jigsaw puzzle that was endlessly being reshuffled. And yet, it's, when you see the film, it's beautifully clear. It's just it's a model of clarity, I think. And that, if you can't credit Walt for that, I don't know who you can credit, because he was still, he didn't, it would have been physically impossible for him to devote the time to it that he did to Snow White, because by that time he had so many other projects in the works as well. And there are only so many hours in a day. But even so, nothing got into that film without his personal stamp on it. I think you could make a real case for Pinocchio as, at least on a technical level, the formal masterpiece of the animated film. Maybe even more than Fantasia, which, wow. and I love Fantasia too, but as far as exemplifying the craft of the animated film, you could improve on Pinocchio. It's a pinnacle of the animator's art, I think. The downside is that it's really hard to appreciate all of it, because after you've been watching for a while, your eye kind of gets saturated, and it's hard to keep appreciating every little detail like that as it comes along. Not too long out of high school, I worked at a movie theater that was showing one of the reissues of Fantasia. And one of the perks was that I got to kind of look into the auditorium every now and then, just kind of at random times, and just look at whatever scene from Fantasia happened to be on the screen at that moment. And it was really striking to me at that time that whatever that moment was, it just kind of stood out in vivid, sharp relief, just what immense artistry went into that moment, which you might not fully appreciate if you're sitting there for 2 hours and being bombarded with those great moments. It's a real argument for just taking a film like this scene by scene and just parsing every detail.
I see so many stories all the time about people who have been on sets with like Muppeteers, and they talk about how, you're sitting there, you're watching someone with their hand in a puppet, and the person's there, but like you spend 1 or 2 minutes just like interacting with them, and all of a sudden you completely forget there's a person there. You're just talking to Elmo, you're talking to Big Bird or something. And I think that is probably just the minor curse of being so incredibly good at what you do.
Yeah, and it is, and the same principle applies to something like this. And in fact, I think that the artists would be pleased if you kind of forgot about them and just got pulled into the story, you know.
Was there a way that when you watch Pinocchio, like maybe for the first time or even like any time you're watching it, like how did it personally affect you? Like what parts stood out the most to you?
Yeah, and is there like a point in the research that really deeply affected you too?
Yeah.
I always tell people that writing a book is really just an excuse to do the research, because when you do that, that's you can really get inside this great movie and explore it and find out what makes it tick. And so the experience of encountering these moments that I'd always loved, and being able to document how they came to be created, that was pretty wonderful. That was there's something really gratifying about that, I think. I feel like Charles Foster Kane looking for Rosebud. It's like, I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm getting a chance to fulfill something that started in childhood, and and in a way that I never could have understood in childhood. And yeah, there is something that is really, really gratifying about that. And again, I don't want to be selfish about this, and I'm hoping that I can communicate some of that love, in the book. And especially if people read the book and then go back to the film and have more of an appreciation for it, that is when I feel like, the effort has been worthwhile. Not that, I think Pinocchio is universally admired anyway, but if I can add to that and keep it going, then I feel really honored to be able to do that.
JB, we just wanted to thank you so much for coming on our show. It really means so much. Your book really, did exactly what you just said. Like, it really enriched our understanding of the movie and our understanding of, Disney history really as a whole. Did you have anything that, is there somewhere people can find you or follow your work?
Well, I do have an official website, which is, it's easy to find. It's just my name, jbkaufman.com. And it will tell you more than you want to know about the things that I'm doing, and, the various books and projects that I have done and am working on now. So, please feel free to drop in.
Well, thank you so much, and once again, we really appreciate you coming on.
And let me say that, let me thank you for the invitation to be with you folks this evening, because I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I feel good about the future of Disney appreciation when I talk to folks like you, because I think you really get it, and I think you will really kind of spread a higher level of appreciation among the people who watch your show.
Oh, that means so much.
Oh, that's our goal.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Where can people find us online?
On YouTube and Instagram.
And that's it.
And that's it for
yeah.
now.
But we're going to keep doing these episodes, and we would really love if we could build our viewership. It'd be really cool to get a little bit more like feedback and stuff like that. It'd be really exciting. Our next episode is going to be about Zootopia. So if you have any thoughts about Zootopia, maybe just put them in the comments. We might be able to incorporate them into the next one. Or even if you just want to leave your thoughts on Pinocchio. Did you think it's one of the greatest animated movies of all time,
or was it just fine?
Was it just fine? We'll see you again next time on Not So Small World.